Good morning, everyone. I'm going to dive in with George, who was Chancellor of the United Kingdom from 2010 to 2016, but shaped British politics for a lot longer than that, on a point that Anna Botín was just making about the danger of Europe becoming a museum if we make the wrong choices. And you're also a chairman of a museum. And so I'd like to start, George, by asking you, compared with when you came into office and we were thinking about European politics together, how do you see the competitive position of Europe against its global competitors? Has things got better, things got worse?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Anna, thank you for inviting me here. And for the 6 years I was finance minister, working with Santander was a pleasure. And Santander, although it was a big presence in the UK, was a challenger to the established British banks and a very good force for driving change in British banking. So for me, it's a delight to be here. And I am chairman of the British Museum, and so I'm not against Europe being a place of great museums, but I agree with Anna that as a European citizen, I don't want Europe itself just to be a museum. And I'm going to start with the picture that you have put on the back there. That is a picture of New York City. And here we are in Europe. And I think what has happened over my time in politics, now I'm also in the private sector in banking, is that the United States has pulled ahead of Europe, including the UK. And that is partly, I think, a consequence of the inherent kind of innovation and entrepreneurial capacity of the American economy, which we saw throughout the 20th century. But it is also partly the result of self-inflicted and imposed mistakes on the European continent, of which, by the way, I would have been part of those mistakes. And I think if I just were to take, two examples, one in banking, the financial crisis, I was the Chancellor immediately after the financial crisis and sat in many European Union meetings, ECOFIN meetings. You were the Commissioner for Financial Services. That financial crisis began in the American banking system. Okay, then it came over to the UK and it hit a number of economies, including Spain, became a fiscal crisis. But it is striking that 15 years on, these American investment banks have become almost monopolistic in their power. And European banks, even fantastic banks like Santander, are not on the same scale in investment banking as a kind of Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs or Bank of America. And there used to be a number of European investment banks that would compete, including UK investment banks. And I've noticed, and that is partly a regulatory response that we were all part of, where we kind of regulated away risk, but I think we may have also regulated away opportunity. And then on the technology front, it is very striking to me that in my own lifetime, you have seen just a complete transformation of the top of the S&P. So if you looked at the biggest companies in America, they did not exist, many of them, when I was a child. You've been very striking in financial markets or equity markets in the last year that it's just a handful of American companies that have powered the growth of those equity markets. Whereas if I was to look at the FTSE in London or the equivalent indexes across Europe, you would see that the top of those indexes look quite similar to the way they would have looked when I was born. Same companies, actually. And Europe has not been able to create an environment in which European tech champions have emerged. Doesn't mean there aren't some fantastic European tech companies. And if you want to be optimistic, you'd say that the kind of startup scene here in Madrid and elsewhere across Europe seems to be really getting going, and American venture is coming here. But I think there are some big questions, as I say, of how we've allowed the American economy, it seems to me, to take that leap forward, and the rest of us have not really kept pace.
Do you think that the regulatory response to the financial crash still weighs too heavily in how Europe thinks about regulation? I mean, do you think we're still looking back too much to risk reduction instead of how can we get to a more sustainable level of risk in our societies?
Well, I think I would sort of frame it in a slightly different way, which is, Europe, and here, we may talk about Brexit. I was very against Brexit, and it's, for me, a tragedy that Britain is not part of this conversation at the moment, but maybe things will change. At a European level, Europe has a big advantage, which is through the European Union, it can set a regulatory structure that can help lead global regulation. We saw it most famously recently in online privacy and digital privacy. And individual US states had to follow the European Union's lead. And for all the problems of European Union coordination and all the sort of frustrations of the EU, it's a lot more functional than the US regulatory system, which is really dysfunctional. So there's an opportunity to be a standard setter. And that's something that Europe should grab with both hands. But in standard setting, you shouldn't regulate the stability of the graveyard. You have to set standards in which innovation are allowed to take place, in which growth is allowed to take place. In financial services, there's a lot of interesting innovation coming, as Anna says, in artificial intelligence, for example, or even in, decentralized currency and so on, digital currency. Why can't Europe be a place where there's a lot of experimentation that takes place within bounds, within protections for consumers? But I think Europe should be prepared to take a bit more risk in that space. And it might find itself, therefore, as a place where businesses want to locate because they actually find the US less progressive. If you look at this week, there's an AI summit taking place in the UK. The G7 has just announced some AI principles, and the White House has just published an executive order on AI. In other words, it's a bit of a muddle. And there's an opportunity, and the European Union is legislating on the AI. Why doesn't the European Union, or indeed maybe you could get across all European nations, some kind of coordination on AI regulation that does allow for experimentation, that does allow for controlled risk. And then this would be a place in which investment and brains and technology would flow.
Yeah. You touched on Brexit, which obviously interrupted both our political careers.
It ended my career. And your job was abolished. British Commissioner at the European Union.
I think this audience would be interested on any observations you have about future relationship between UK, EU, and the development of the EU.
Well, to my mind, this is the kind of biggest tragedy of my political life, Britain's decision to leave the European Union. And we won't kind of relitigate, but I was part of the government that held that referendum, and we should not have had the referendum. If you now look at where we are today, however, you would say you've got the European Union, you've got one of the largest countries in Europe outside the European Union, and it is not finding life particularly comfortable outside the European Union. A lot of the promises that we could be a kind of Singapore on the Thames have not materialized. It's proved difficult in many respects to sort of depart from European Union regulation. And if you go back to the original result, 48% of the country voted to remain in and 52% voted to leave. I don't think Britain will rejoin the European Union in my lifetime. No. But I do think Britain can rejoin some of the economic arrangements inside the European Union, which would be fairer to the result of the referendum. And I think there's a lot of encouraging talk amongst the European leadership, for example, from President Macron, of a kind of multi-tiered Europe, of a European political community, of associate membership of the EU. Now, I don't know if any of those things particularly would be the right thing for the UK, and the UK may want to call it like a British deal, rather like the Swiss have with the EU, or the Norwegians. But I think we should find a way to try and rejoin some elements of the customs union and the single market. And I would say, just as time is running out, there's an opportunity. So first of all, there'll be probably a change of government in the UK next year, not certain, but probably. There'll be a Labour government which won't have as much baggage as the Conservative. I was a Conservative Chancellor, but there'll be a Labour government. And the only thing I would say to the kind of European leadership is forget about the past, forget about the kind of frustrations with the UK, forget about the anger over Brexit, and forget about kind of punishing the UK. And instead, if we want to move forward as a continent, you can't leave out the UK, and be open-minded about some interesting new arrangement whereby Britain can rejoin the family of European nations.
Okay, fantastic. There's so many things I'd like to pick up on, but we're out of time. So, ladies and gentlemen, could you join me in thanking George Osborne?
Thank you.